Before we continue, this is not a religious talk. There is no God or belief in any kind of a denomination required to understand that the deluge was a real historical event. We do not need supernatural beings for there to have been a catastrophic flood that assaulted Earth only thousands of years ago.
Haha, wait, hold on. Do not shut this off. We are not going to be preaching young Earth creationism or God or religion or anything like that. Remember, on this channel, I do not believe in God. I have no religion. So if you're wondering why the hell am I talking about the deluge, which is obviously a crazy Christian religious thing, how can we talk about something like that in a context that is serious if we are not going to engage in discussion about, some kind of a crazy, fantastical god that gets pissed off at everybody and decides to flood the planet with magical water that reaches the highest mountain peak? Yeah, I know, it sounds crazy. And up until about, maybe 10 years ago or so, I also thought that story was insane. However, there is a problem, and as a historian, it was something that I had ignored forever, and the only reason I had ignored this problem was because I was taught to ignore it, and that problem is this. When we look all over the planet, we find a situation to where cultures everywhere, and I mean literally everywhere, and we'll talk about them, all cultures, for some weird reason, seem to have a deluge story. And it is very specifically the deluge. I'm not talking about, random, flood stories or something that, hey, yeah, a river really overflowed that year and the people were really stupid and so they just thought the entire planet overflowed or whatever. That's not what these people describe. These people all over the planet, all of our ancestors, are very clear in their descriptions. And their description is simple. The human race had become extraordinarily wicked, and the God in the sky decided that humans should be wiped off the face of the planet. And God decides to do it, or some cases it's multiple gods. The gods decide to do this with a huge flood that inundates and drowns the entire planet. Now, another quirk that pops up in the deluge story, once again, all cultures all over this planet, for some weird reason, also have this as well. We find a situation to where a man and his wife are warned of the flood, and they go and they save a bunch of animals and they get on an ark, and then when the deluge comes, that ark is essentially supposed to be the only survivor after the catastrophic event. Now, if it was like one or two cultures that had this very general story, fine. We could, hey, all right, statistically, sure, maybe, yeah, okay, fine, maybe two cultures on this planet who had never talked to each other might come to this kind of a conclusion with a mythology, so, all right, whatever, right? But that's not what we find, is it? We find cultures all over this planet with this exact story, and it's this exact story. Now, there are little details that go in there, but the points that I just went over, the flood, the God being mad at humanity, the saving, the man and the woman saving all of the life in a little ark, the ark floating on the waters, and then eventually the water's draining, and then that guy and his wife and the animals on the ark disembark, and then they go and, proliferate and blah, 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 whatever. Why is it that cultures all over this planet have that exact same story arc? Story arc. Okay. You know what I'm saying? What happened? How the hell does somebody in Africa and South America have this exact same story? How the hell does somebody in Africa and the Inuit up there in the Northern Hemisphere have the exact same story? Why is it that North American Indian tribes also have the story just like the Aboriginals down in Australia? Why is it that all humans all over this planet, for some weird reason, have the exact same story ingrained into their ancient histories? This is a legitimate problem in history. And as a historian, I was trained to ignore all of this stuff. You know, essentially, it's funny, in modern Western society, pretty much everybody, even biblical people nowadays, I'll get into yelling at you guys in a second as well, but we're all trained to completely ignore anything that happens in something like the Bible or North American Indian tribes mythologies, or basically anything that is a mythology. We are to take those aspects of their culture as nothing else other than feats of fancy. Other than, you know, just crazy stories that were told to kids at bedtime or, you know, whatever, right? We are taught not to pay attention to that stuff because we are told that there is no possible way that any of this stuff could have happened anyways, because if you look at mainstream science offers no scientific explanation as to how any of the events that are recorded by ancient cultures all over the planet, such as the deluge, could have possibly happened. Now that makes sense. All right, now I get it, because of course something like the deluge is insane. For example, one of the claims in the deluge mythology, and I'm just going to use the term deluge because that covers basically everybody. I'm not going to use the flood as a term to describe the deluge, because when we say the word flood, I mean, that really could indicate, you know, a general flood. You know, hey, yeah, we had a really bad rainy day or whatever, and the river overflowed and it sucked and we got flooded. Like, that's a flood. And then, of course, after the deluge, there actually is one other mega flood event that will assault planet Earth, but it's a completely different kind of a flood, and I would hate to even use the terminology flood for that event either. So anyways, I'm not going to use the term flood. We are going to use the term deluge. Now, before we go further, here, let me give you guys a breakdown of a lot of the cultures that have a deluge kind of a story, so that at least you don't have to think I'm that crazy, because I'm not the one making any of this stuff up. There are cultures all over the planet with the deluge flood myth. I'm not using the term flood. With the deluge myth. All right, so we have Mesopotamian, right? All of those cultures down there. We have Sumerian, we have the Akkadian and the Babylonians, we have the Assyrians. All four of those cultures, you know, by the way, Akkadian and Sumerian, they're probably the exact same culture, so we probably shouldn't even say it like that. Essentially, the Sumerian, Babylonians, and Assyrians, they all have a deluge story. Of course, when we look over at the Hebrew and the Christian traditions, they obviously have the flood story, and that's kind of what gives the deluge the bad rap that it has nowadays with respect to any kind of a Western understanding of it, right? Because there is a huge attack going on against Abrahamic religions, which are mainly focused against Christianity and, of course, Catholicism. For some weird reason, Islam and Judaism gets a free pass from militant atheists. And I have yet to see a single militant atheist tell me why they do not attack those two religions who believe in essentially the exact same thing like they attack Christians and Catholicism. I would love to hear the excuses, please, if you've got... Okay, I know, okay. Anyway, moving on to Greek traditions. Now, Greek is interesting, and I only want to cover this because I want to cover it because there's an interesting conundrum with Greek mythology. So in Greek mythology, they have two separate floods. They have the flood known as the flood of Deucalion and the flood of Ogyges. Now, if I'm pronouncing that weird and wrong, I'm sorry. I'm just going to call it the flood of Ogyges. That's what I've heard it my whole life, so that's what I'm going to do. Anyways, these two floods are interesting because even though the floods are, you know, described as wiping out the general area of Greece, you know, kind of getting rid of the Mediterranean area, it does not necessarily mean that this flood is referencing the deluge. Now, this subject is a completely different subject, not necessarily in the scope of this show, but one of the problems that we have when we look at deluge myths is that we find a situation to where a lot of ancient cultures have two major flood, disaster, catastrophic periods in their history. You have the deluge, and then later on, which might be like, a couple of 1,000+ years after the deluge, you have another catastrophic event that deals with a ton of water. However, the second event that takes place after the deluge is a completely differently described event. So the floods of Deucalion and Ogyges, there's a good chance that these two descriptions are actually describing the second flood event happens that's brought upon by another quote-unquote god, which we would nowadays attribute to the planet Venus. And I know, it sounds crazy. I'll get into the planets and all that stuff in just a second. So if you're wondering about Greek mythology gives us a problem because Greek mythology might be confusing the deluge with the event that takes place after the deluge, a couple millennium or a few millennia later. Yeah, I know, it gets weird. We'll try to see if we can put all this together. Anyway, I wanted to throw the Greek stuff in there just because a lot of historians will call this out, and rightfully so. They will also say, but wait a second, ancient Greek, they also have some kind of a flood event, and that's true. However, what's interesting is that the Greek mythology might not actually be referencing the deluge. And what has happened is that mainstream historians that came later have looked back at these flood stories, and because mainstream historians have very little to work with in their toolbox when it comes to objectively studying history and trying to figure out what's going on, they just see a grand flood and they will immediately lump it into the deluge category. The Ogyges and Deucalion floods probably reference the Venus event situation that goes down much later than the deluge. Anyway, moving on. We find in Hindu mythology we have something called Manu's flood. Now, Manu is considered the first man. What happens is that dude is warned that there is going to be a huge flood and that he builds a huge boat and then he saves humanity and he also saves all the sacred texts and everything like that. But, basically the story of Noah. I'm not going to recount Noah. I mean, everybody knows Noah generally. Noah, old dude, gets warned by, God, hey, I'm going to kill everybody, build a boat. He builds a boat, he saves animals, blah, 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 okay? That's the general concept. So Manu's flood is the same concept. Moving on to Norse mythology, we find the same basic story with Bergelmir's flood. And in that story, essentially that primordial giant Ymir is slain and all of his blood goes out everywhere and it floods the world and blah, blah, blah. Same kind of concept. Moving on over to North America, we have Indian tribes over there, such as the Hopis myth, to where a flood myth describes how a spider woman and the gods saved virtuous people by leading them to safety before a great deluge. So that concept of saving the good while the wicked get wiped out. Aztecs, same situation. The flood story of Tlaloc describes a punishment for human impiety, with survivors floating on a piece of wood. Same concept. The Maya in the Popol Vuh mention a flood that used to destroy an earlier race of what they called wooden people. And that's a whole other story. But anyway, same thing. Inca had the exact same story as well. The Algonquin, they have the same stuff as well. It's absolutely insane. And they all have the exact same fundamental root part of the story. The wicked die, the good survive, but the good that survive are generally only a couple of people or a few people, depending on, which mythology you're looking at. Then we can look at Polynesian cultures. Polynesian cultures have the same thing, right? Hawaiians, they have the flood myth of Nu'u that involves a man who builds a canoe to escape a deluge. The Maori in New Zealand describe the exact same thing. They have floods caused by the gods to reshape the land or to punish humanity. Now let's travel over to Africa, where once again we find the exact same situation. The Kauai tribe has a story of a man and his wife surviving a great flood by climbing up a mountain and saving seeds and animals. The only difference here, of course, is that there's no ark. But there's still the mountaintop that they are sitting on with all the saving of the animals and the seeds, just like Noah's Ark, to where that ark runs into a mountain. So technically, the ark would have been on top of a mountain at a certain point in time. Yeah, I wonder what that means, by the way. Isn't that crazy? Why? Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Traveling back up north, if we go and look at Celtic mythology, the Welsh have a myth of Dwyfan and Dwyfach, which involves a great flood, with those two survivors repopulating the earth once the waters subsides. All right, you guys get it, right? I mean, I could go on forever. How much more evidence as historians do we need that something is going on in the ancient past? I mean, why do we find a situation to where all of these ancient cultures, which, according to mainstream historians, never had any contact with one another, why do we find all of these guys having and possessing the exact same story? What's going on? Now, mainstream historians have ignored this problem, and they ignore it for, the reasons why I talked about earlier on. And the only reason why is because they've been trained to ignore it. They do not possess the historical or scientific tools to apply to any kind of a critical thinking methodology to analyze these mythologies or these supposed mythologies and maybe come to a different conclusion. So the premise is simple. If our ancestors are going to make the claim that something like the deluge happened, and they're going to take the time to record it in their histories and make sure that it is transmitted down the ages, it is our responsibility to pay attention to what they say. If you think about it, especially in the Western world, why is it that the power structure is so obsessed right now with destroying religion, for example? And not just religion. Basically, anybody who has a mythology, really, I mean, it's anybody who has any kind of a mythology that talks about anything like the deluge, for example. And there's a lot of other stuff as well they're trying to destroy. We will stay focused in this show. I'm going to do my best. But they're very focused on trying to make sure that nobody believes that this is a real event. Why? Who cares? Why are they so obsessed with literally creating hate campaigns trying to tear down not only Western people's religions, but people's mythologies all over the planet? You're not allowed to take the Maori religions or mythologies serious. You're not allowed to do that, right? There's no historian on this planet, in the mainstream anyways, that is going to look at you and take you seriously if you take the Maori mythologies seriously. Right? If you take the Norse mythology seriously, no historian is going to think that you're highly intelligent. They are going to immediately excommunicate you. They are not going to pay attention to you. Right? They've already been trained to discard anybody who looks at these subjects and takes them seriously. Why? I mean, what's the point? Who cares if there was an event that took place in the past that was something like the deluge? If it happened, it happened. Who gives a crap? Why does this matter? Why is the system going out of its way to try and erase events like this? That's a legitimate scientific question, by the way. What the hell is going on? And the reality is this. The only reason you try to erase something is because you have something you are trying to hide. There is something there that if you are in a high position of power, you do not want the masses to know. Because if the masses learn the truth, then there is a potential strength that can come out of that truth. And that's the world we live in right now. There are people on this planet who are not interested in sharing the truth with you or me. All right, so the deluge. What's going on? Now, the first thing we have to get over is, well, let's get right to it. How do we explain it? If we're going to say that it actually happened and we are going to take the mythologies seriously, we have a lot of problems that we run into, don't we? And yeah, we do. Okay, we have to explain a lot of stuff. Hopefully, at this point, you are willing to give me the benefit of the doubt, because as I've just built up a case, everybody talks about this event, so there's got to be something to it. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to take it seriously. We're going to say, hey, look, if these guys say that the entire planet was flooded up to the highest peak, let's just take it seriously. Now, immediately, we have a physics problem, right? We have a volume problem. We have a water problem. Because right now, when we look at planet Earth, it's not that we can't just imagine. It's impossible to take all of the water that currently exists on Earth and make it cover the highest peak. I mean, we have peaks on this planet that are 20,000 plus feet in the air. It does not take a genius to look around and realize that the current amount of water on this planet is not going to cover those peaks. It's just not going to happen. So when we find cultures telling us that the highest mountain peaks were covered by water, immediately this calls everything they're talking about into question, and rightfully so. I mean, like I said, it takes a 2-year-old to figure this out. There's no possible way this could happen. So what happened? What made it to where our ancestors decided to add this crazy story into their history? I mean, something had to have happened. I mean, it's not like one culture has it. If 1 or 2 cultures had it, fine, whatever. They're crazy, they were smoking all kinds of crack, and we can move on. But when every single culture has the story, we have to pay attention. Now, as historians, we are literally required to pay attention to this because this is a scientific problem. This is not a problem that we can just walk away from and just hand wave it away as if they were all smoking crack all at the same time. As if there was some magical crack dealer flying around the world just giving everybody crack and then everybody had the exact same hallucination. There is no way that happened. I mean, what makes sense anyways? I mean, how does mainstream history even explain this situation at all? They don't even have one. Mainstream historians literally have to ignore the problem because if they engage in the problem, well, then that causes a problem for them, right? Especially if you're like a secular historian. I don't think it's actually legal for any of those guys to be able to even acknowledge this. I don't even think it's legal for any of those guys to even acknowledge that these stories exist and that there might be something to them. And I don't just mean like on the flood situation. What I mean is that there might be something to the fact that maybe perhaps what it shows is that everybody was connected back in the day, even though mainstream history says they weren't. You know, there would be that possibility. I mean, if we play that side of the card and we just follow the evidence, let's just ignore the actual possibility of a flood for a second, or a bunch of water. Let's do that. A deluge. Now, if we ignore that and we just see that everybody has that common tale, that has to mean something scientifically, right? I mean, that is objective scientific evidence that really should not be ignored, and yet the mainstream does just that. They don't even acknowledge the fact that this actually might present a real problem and might lead in a completely different direction than what the mainstream right now currently follows. Anyway, it's just funny. Yeah, okay, well, let's take that train of thought. So if we have all of these cultures who are, talking about the exact same kind of an event, what does that mean? I mean, does that mean that potentially everybody was kind of connected at a certain point in time in history? Perhaps. I mean, that's a legitimate possibility. The only problem with that direction, unfortunately, mainstream people are probably correct to a degree on this when you think about it. We don't have any real reason to believe that there was this ultra mega worldwide civilization that was talking to each other, 10, 12, 20,000 years ago or whatever. We don't have that kind of scientific evidence. And I know the alternative research community, there's a huge chunk of them that absolutely, loves the concept of there being some super hyper ultra advanced civilization that spans the entire planet and everybody is teleporting around in their flying cars and UFOs and the internet is alive and well or whatever, or everybody is just psychically talking to each other and spreading porn, whatever. That I realize that there is a huge chunk of people out there who believe that, but the reality is, and I hate to say it, but we really do not have any scientific evidence which is indisputable, which is real. I mean, I'm talking real scientific evidence that supports that theory that there was indeed some kind of a crazy global civilization. It's just not there. And I'm not trying to, take a crap on anybody's head or, smoke a lot of crack and then take a crap on your idea or whatever. Basically, everybody's smoking crack in this episode today, apparently. But the evidence just isn't there. So if we're going to look at the fact that everybody has some kind of a flood mythology, but we don't have any evidence that everybody was communicating with one another, that leads us to a completely different scientific conclusion, actually. And what that conclusion is that, everybody has this story because everybody on the planet suffered from this event. And it really is that simple. And we can come to that conclusion just by basic scientific deduction, right? We just used extremely basic critical thinking skills while employing scientific evidence, and we can just come to that conclusion. See how easy that is? Do you see how simple history really is if you just pay attention to what our ancestors are saying? So, now we have a problem. Because now we have a situation to where we can legitimately make the claim that all of the deluge mythologies are indeed potentially based on a real event. Now, there is something interesting which I don't generally see anybody point out when it comes to the deluge mythology versus other kinds of mythologies or events that would take place after the deluge. When we look at other events that take place after the deluge, we find those events are often described in more detail. For example, when we find other catastrophes that take place after the deluge, those catastrophes are generally talked about with more of a scientific fervor almost. And in some cases, legitimate scientific notation is used to describe some of the events and some of the catastrophes. Now, those catastrophes would be things like the Venus event. When we hear about the Venus event and we look at all of the stuff that went on there, there's a lot of details told there from all cultures all over the world. But one of the major details that we find that is not present with respect to the deluge story is that we find that later events are told very much from the perspective of the people and where they are geographically relative to the catastrophe. What I mean by that is that when we look at the deluge, everybody's deluge story is essentially the same. Everybody's deluge story is told not so much in a detailed way. People are not breaking down the events and how things went down in a local kind of an area. Not really. I know you can kind of dig some stuff up here and there, but even the stuff you dig up, what you're going to find is that much, and I mean much of the information you do find is extremely similar or almost identical, or it is identical compared to other cultures relative to the deluge situation. So for example, the Venus event. The Venus event happens a couple thousand years probably, or maybe a few thousand years later after the deluge. I don't have a date. I really don't have a date. It would be several thousand plus years after the deluge, probably. But that event is closer to us now in history than the deluge event is. Now, the Venus event takes place and people have recovered from the deluge, basically, and they've been able to build up societies. And those societies have been able to advance to various levels, and those various levels of advancement have allowed for various levels of recording history. And some of that history is legitimately recorded in scientific notation. I mean, people have calendars running, right? We have equations. People are tracking the stars. People are tracking the planets. Tracking the planets was really important because the planets were causing all of the problems on Earth. So everybody was tracking this stuff, and a lot of this, well, I don't want to say a lot of the information, but some of this information has survived and been brought down to us today. So we can actually look at stuff like the Mayan calendar, for example, or we can go and we can look at Egyptian horoscopes, or, we can look at all of this stuff and we can scientifically read it and start to corroborate some of the events or some of the catastrophic events that took place, and we can break it down at a scientific level. The reason why we can do that is because something like the Venus event is closer to us now in history than the deluge was. Now, this brings up another problem with the deluge, actually, because if you have other catastrophic events that take place after the deluge, what's going to happen to all of that evidence that the deluge would have left if you have other catastrophic events that happen to the planet Earth that absolutely completely reshape the entire surface of the planet? Well, all of that evidence for the deluge is going to be essentially obliterated. So we find a situation to where not only would any kind of a culture who may have recorded the deluge in any kind of great detail. Let's just pretend for a second that some cultures survive the deluge, they pull themselves out of the water, and they're able to start writing stuff down, and they're able to start printing books, stuff like that, right? They're actually able to record what just happened so that future generations could learn about it. Well, that's great. You have books, you're recording, blah, blah, blah. But if you have another cataclysm that shows up a few thousand years later, and all of a sudden all of those books are being smashed, burned, slaughtered, being gobbled up by the planet, I mean, you name it. When the Venus event happens, the entire face of the Earth is literally reshaped. All shorelines are reshaped. This is where all of the mountain ranges that we currently have right now appear. When we have that kind of devastation, any civilization that would have had any kind of recording of the deluge, that stuff is just going to be wiped out. And, of course, after the Venus event happens, when people pull themselves out of that catastrophe, people are not going to be worried too much about recording the deluge, because the deluge to them is ancient history even back then. They're not going to care about really trying to record something that happened, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago after they just went through one of the most horrific cataclysms you could ever imagine happening. I mean, they're going to focus on recording the Venus event. And that's what we find in history. When we look back at all of the catastrophes that have been recorded by all of these different ancient cultures, we find a lot of great detail, relatively speaking, when it comes to the Venus event catastrophe. And then there's another set of catastrophes, more minor, but they definitely change the planet permanently. Anyway, what we find is that everybody records those catastrophes, and we have the details for those events. The deluge and the details for the deluge, they're not there anymore. Now, I know some of you guys may want to run over and point towards the Bible, right? Or you might want to point towards maybe something like Gilgamesh and stuff like that. Well, even Gilgamesh with Utnapishtim, I mean, there's not really a whole lot of information there either. Anyway, the point is that when we start to look at all cultures all over this planet relative to the information that we still have relative to the deluge, we find a situation to where the information has been very distilled down into several main talking points. We don't find that situation with catastrophic events that happen later. It's funny. This train of thought actually goes a great distance into proving something like the Venus event took place. because this is the exact kind of history we would expect to survive, relatively speaking, right? If there was a great deluge back in the day, and then there was another Earth-destroying catastrophe that happened afterward, we would really legitimately expect humans to kind of forget about the really ancient stuff. I mean, like nowadays, your modern human does not care about what happened 2,000 years ago. There's no connection, and that's natural. I'm not getting on anybody for not really caring about what happened 2,000 years ago. The reality is, we all have a very natural disassociative state lodged into our psyche when it comes to something that would have happened 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years is a long time. I know geologists are going to say, oh, 2,000 years is nothing. We talk in millions and billions. And, it makes you want to choke geologists. 2,000 years is a long time, and a long time will create a disassociative state. If you don't think that the people who were living 2,000 years ago had a disassociative state relative to the deluge, you're crazy. To people living 2,000 years ago, they didn't care about the deluge, right? They maybe had some better records of it, for example, but nobody was really attached to it. At that point in time, even to those people, something like the deluge may have well have just been some kind of a crazy fantasy. In fact, there's actually good reason to believe that a lot of our ancestors 2,000 years ago honestly believed that the deluge essentially never happened, right? There is some evidence that shows that, yeah, your general human completely doubted the concept of the deluge, right? And the reason why is simple. They were just so far removed from it, it just didn't matter. So it's just like us today. We're even further removed from all of this stuff. So it's really hard to get a true, deep grasp or have a really good understanding of what was going on back in the day. Or even trying to get an idea of what everybody was thinking back in the day, because it's just not there anymore, right? Nobody cares. What the hell am I talking about? Anyway, I'm just blabbing. You get my point, right? My main point is that people who would have been recording history 2,000 years ago relative to something like the deluge, they would not have cared, just like most people today do not care. And that means something, because what that means is that even if they were still recording what their ancestors said, it begs the question, how much of that did they really care about? So we would expect to actually find a situation to where when something like the Venus event catastrophe hit Earth, anything that had to do with the deluge would have immediately been pushed into the background, right? Nobody would have cared about that because they really would have been too busy, well, A, trying to survive and pull themselves out of that catastrophe, but B, when they were recording history, they would be recording what had just happened to them right in front of their faces. It was something that they had personally lived through, so that history right there would have immediately become infinitely more important than something like the deluge. So what that means is that the deluge would have naturally shifted into more of a mythological state instead of a real historical state. And this would be expected due to the natural flow of how history went. And of course, how, human civilization evolves, how human psyche works with respect to time and all of that. It's funny, right? Like that train of thought proves all of that to one degree or another. Yeah, that's interesting, huh? So when we look at the flood mythology really is taught and recorded in a mythological way. And that's what we see. And it's interesting to note, after all the stuff we just talked about, that we would expect an event like that to be mythologized, while other histories came to the forefront and took precedence for our ancestors relative to what they found important to record. Right? So their immediate catastrophes they dealt with, that's just going to be more important than the deluge, some weird event that took place thousands of years ago. Yeah, they may not have even doubted it took place. And in fact, you could probably also argue that back during this period of time, people would have had zero issue believing in the deluge being a real event. And the reason why would be simple. Because 2,000-ish years ago or so, the planets were not in their current configuration. Our ancestors 2,000 years ago actually would have been able to see the surfaces of several planets very close by, right? There were various instances where Mars does a sort of a flyby here and there. Venus obviously becomes a huge problem, and we have every reason to believe that our ancestors could actually see Venus and Mars, not through a telescope, but in the night sky as if it was like, say, the size of the moon or bigger. They did not need any kind of optical help to have or help them see the surface of these planets. The planets were right there, right? And this is what they record. So when their ancestors talk about the quote-unquote God flooding the planet, it's not unbelievable to them because they can see the planets right now moving around. You know, they're moving, shaking, doing things, slapping each other around. They witnessed this with their own eyes. So it's not weird for them to think that, oh yes, a different planetary body could have caused a potential worldwide flood. So for our ancestors who would have been recording this stuff back then, they would have been recording all of these histories in a completely different context. So yeah, they may have actually believed all of this stuff. And of course, they would have had access to way more detailed information than we have now. So, okay, anyway, but this brings us to a very interesting conclusion. What that means is that if other histories are going to take precedence, that means earlier histories are probably going to be condensed. And that is exactly what we find with the deluge mythology. So instead of having this huge detailed situation, it's going to be condensed down so that it's easily transmittable, while also focusing on the newer history and the newer catastrophes, because those would have been more relevant to the cultures at the time. Okay, so that's interesting. And I don't even remember what I was doing in this show. Now I'm just talking. But let's keep going, because you know what? I mean, there's some good lines of thought here. There really is. We are breaking some stuff down here. All right, so we have established why we would expect to find the deluge in some kind of a mythological state, rather than a state in as we would find later histories recorded by our ancestors. There is some logic there, and that logic does follow the historical evidence and the scientific evidence. So that's good. Okay. Now the next question we have to answer is, all right, fine, everybody suffered a great deluge. Okay, whatever. How does everybody have the exact same story when it comes to the characters? That is a very good question. And this is a tough one, and this is one of the ones that I don't have an answer to, by the way. But let's explore this problem a little bit, and then maybe some of you guys can actually point me in the right direction, because it's a weird issue. So, in all of the deluge myths, or at least most of the deluge myths, there is essentially a man and a wife, where the man has been warned by some kind of I'll just say an agent. Somebody came down and said, hey dude, we're about to flood the planet, build a boat and get all the life you can into that boat, and good luck. This is a common theme. Now, if everybody experienced the deluge, and you would expect that, we have to ask the question, how did this go down? I mean, did every single culture on the planet that would go through the deluge have some weird random person show up and warn them? That's a legitimate question, actually. So if we have a bunch of civilizations hanging around the planet, who the hell was this guy that came down and warned everybody? Right? If that's what happened, I mean, and did all cultures have this exact event happen? Think about it. Did all cultures get a warning from somebody, and then for whatever reason, a man and a woman shoved a bunch of animals in life into a boat and just tried to ride out the deluge? Is that what every single culture did? Because that is the way the mythology is told. Now, I don't have a direct answer for that. It's not impossible, I suppose. Although it does beg the question, right? Like, who the hell was the person that warned everybody? And where did that guy come from? And what does that really mean about everything else that was happening pre-deluge? That gets crazy as well. That's out of scope for this talk, but it's a legitimate problem. Did every culture have a person do this? Maybe. That's a possibility. That really is. Of course, we don't have any scientific evidence to prove that. So, for example, we don't have evidence of everybody building an ark back in the day. Like, we don't have the arks, right? We don't have anything to substantiate that multiple arks were built during this period of time. And even more to the point, we don't have anybody in the stories saying anything like, hey, we've come down to warn, 2 people out of every single culture to build an ark. You have been chosen to do it. That is not part of the mythology, is it? The way the mythology is taught, the mythology is just, hey, there is one dude on the planet that gets warned, and, the context can be slightly different per culture. Anyway, Noah, essentially, or Utnapishtim, or whatever you want to choose, that dude gets warned, but he is the only one that gets warned. We really do not have any reason to believe that all cultures pre-deluge were all warned to some degree or another. That does not appear to be the case. Now, just to cover my bases, I want to make it clear that, hey, I'm open to that concept. Maybe that is what happened, right? That's possible. But if we take what our ancestors say seriously, that does not seem to be the case. If that's not the case, then how does everybody have this same story then? I mean, think about it. If only one dude is warned, why would everybody have this mythology? Well, the basic and most simple answer would be somehow the story of the deluge would eventually be communicated to all of the survivors. So let's just say that Utnapishtim is the only dude that is warned, and he survives, he brings all the animals and blah, blah, blah. Waters recede and everybody starts rebuilding. And I know there's problems with potential human survivors, right? The Bible would have everybody essentially being from Noah at some point in time. Isn't that how they do it? I'm not a Bible scholar here, but isn't that basically what would have happened? Is that everybody comes from Noah and then like Ham and Shem or whatever the hell their names are? I don't know. Anyway, that's a little weird. I mean, that's genetically, that gets a little weird, and that's a problem for you Abrahamic people. Like, I'm not convinced. You guys are gonna have to figure that one out for me before I start, listening to that more closely. Yeah. Anyway, but the story is there. And it begs the question, were there other survivors? Because that would potentially happen. If the deluge was a real event, even if some dude was warned, it's entirely possible that other people would have survived. And when the waters receded finally, obviously those survivors would have been able to start new civilizations out there as well, completely disconnected from wherever Noah or Utnapishtim landed, right? So you would be dealing with that as well. So, but what that means is that you would expect there to be people who would be disconnected from the Utnapishtim figure, right? Because Utnapishtim could obviously tell his story down to his descendants if everybody was descended, and that's how that story could have been disseminated. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So if, for some weird reason, everybody is descended from that one survivor, fine, we have our explanation, don't we? And so as everybody started to proliferate, they would have taken that story with them. So that makes sense. All right, fine. But, I guess if there were other survivors, eventually they would run into the survivors from Noah. And, okay, all right. So basically the story would spread over time. Okay, that might be an explanation as to why everybody would have this story to one degree or another. Yeah, okay, fair enough. So if we follow that logic, we could actually come to some kind of conclusion like that. And yeah, you know what? It's funny. Okay, so check this out, actually. So when a lot of cultures started expanding and exploring the world over the past, let's just say a millennia or so, what was being discovered was that everybody already had this deluge story, right? It was already there. It was already ingrained within their religion or within their mythology. And the explanation as to why basically always fell under two categories. Either the first category was their ancestors were from the actual survivor. Okay. And that's a legitimate thing. That happened in many cultures. The other explanation as to why they had the flood or the deluge mythology was because people came from other parts of the world and told them about it. Yeah, well, and that isn't that, huh? So that would follow logically. I mean, that's actually exactly what we would expect to find if the deluge had actually happened. And, of course, if the Venus event had also happened afterwards. Because remember, the deluge, it's ingrained in their history, but the Venus event really does wipe clean a lot of cultures and a lot of history. So the way people remember stuff gets weird because everybody across the planet would have been fragmented like crazy during that particular catastrophe, the Venus catastrophe. So their stories would have been mixed up as well, right? So some people would maintain that they were the descendants, and others would later on get the story from other people who had still remembered it or who were the actual descendants. Huh? Yeah. Well, the logic really does flow. Huh. Okay, you know what? Yeah, I'm like answering my own stupid questions. Remember, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about anymore. Okay. So anyway, we'll wrap this up. My point was, after all of this garbage that we just talked about, was it's worth paying attention to mythologies in general, but the deluge mythology really does serve and really does seem to have a lot of merit when it comes to understanding our past. Now, I know the deluge is a hard thing to swallow for a lot of people simply because it sounds insane, and I have done nothing to explain it at all. But that was not the point of this show. The point of this show was to not substantiate the flood. I kind of already done that in a couple of other shows. We'll go over the flood the deluge. I know I'm like breaking my own rule. We'll go over the science of the deluge. Well, we'll do that in another episode here shortly. Let's do that. That sounds fair. My main point of this show, I know, 10 years after talking about trash, was just to make sure that you guys don't just discard this. Remember, if you're willing to believe aliens built the pyramids, it's really not all that much of a stretch to imagine that a planet was inundated with water. That's not really all that big of a deal. The Earth, remember, is just a little speck in space, and space is incredibly violent. There is nothing weird about a planet being enveloped in water from space. Remember that, okay? That's just a little tease for those of you who don't know where the water came from, and for those of you who are interested in learning more, we'll talk about it in more depth. I don't think I've done a real in-depth scientific talk yet that validates the concept of the deluge. Yeah, and that's something that I should probably do. Remember, everything on this channel is connected, so the deluge event is extremely important in human history. I mean, obviously, if you're going to have the planet flood, that's going to matter, right? That's going to set the stage for future generations to have to deal with all kinds of garbage, and that's exactly what happened. Okay, all right, we're done. You get it. All right. You like how I can't stay focused at all in this stuff? Like it's just there's just too much going on. I swear to God.